Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Kingdoms and Castles. So this game's kind of boring to talk about, but is pretty chill to watch, so I want to think of some other thing to talk about while I'm playing this game here. So what I ended up deciding to do is do a post-recording of the game. For those of you wondering, I am playing this on the harder difficulty, but even then, the game, well actually no, the game's merciless as shit. You're just going to end up in a spiral of getting raided by barbarians that stops you from building defenses to stop the next wave of barbarians. Anyway, that aside, yeah, I'm going to be playing this in the background, but instead I figured why not talk about something that's been trendy lately, and that is, D&D stories. I think that the reason I want to talk about this is not only because it seems that people are interested in those, just from my own feed, or maybe it's I'm interested in those and I subscribe to people who tell D&D stories. Either way, like, if you want to talk to somebody who's got, like, loads and loads of stories, talk to someone who plays Dungeons and Dragons, because they have stories. That's literally all they have, really. Yeah, I mean, it'll break you down, it'll destroy you, it'll, like, take away your house, your belongings, your money, and all you'll have left is your stories. You'll be a wandering minstrel. It's inevitable. Don't play D&D, kids. You'll turn into a bard. Anyway, beyond that, yeah, I think I want to talk about this in a sort of more directed way, though, than just to say, this is something that happened. And what I want to do for my very first video talking about this was something that's kind of like a contrary note to what you see floating around from time to time. In the D&D-osphere of people who play these sorts of games, you'll occasionally hear the opinion that different characters are more interesting than others, and one of the most common ones that you'll hear is that weak characters are more interesting than others. Now, sort of as a counterpoint to that, I'm actually going to say the exact opposite of that, that stronger characters are more interesting from a story perspective than weak characters. And this isn't going to be universal, same as a lot of the people who talk about how weak characters can be more interesting narratively. They're not talking every single time. I'm just putting this out here as sort of counterpoint to that, where a lot of people sort of go into the game thinking, I'll make this really lousy character with like loads of crippling character flaws, and that'll be super interesting, and it isn't always. Now, I should also mention there are different ways that people define weakness and strength in D&D, and sometimes you'll hear people even jumping around between all those sorts of different ones in the same sort of video or post or blog article or literally anything. Internet argument in the comments section, that too, So one way that a character can be weak is that they've got really weak stats, so they've got a weak class and they've got a weak build. And if you've got that sort of weakness there, like, this is the least narratively interesting sort of character because, well, I'll get into that. Let's do the anecdote now, actually. So if you're playing this kind of weak character, in my opinion, this is the absolute most damaging to the argument that weak characters are more interesting narratively. So let's talk about a story that I had when I was playing a pretty recent game. So a DM of mine was running the Reign of Winter, I think, is the pre-made campaign. I haven't actually read it because I wasn't running it, and that means that, of course, why bother buying all the books and reading them if I'm not going to be the one running the thing? All that would do is get me a bunch of spoilers. But in any event, we start off the game, we all roll up our characters, we roll our stats randomly as, our group does. Our particular group's standard metric for rolling is we roll the dice, and we roll 4 dice 6 times. Take the highest 3 numbers each set of rolls and add those together. It's a pretty typical sort of rolling metric. And one of our players actually got an absolutely abysmal roll. His total bonus modifier, for those of you who are in the lingo, is like a +2 after all the pluses minuses kick in, and a +2 total modifier is actually the lowest that you were allowed to have on a character before your DM is forced to let you re-roll your character. So this is the weakest your stats are legally allowed to be in a standard game before, the game just is like, okay, well, we're just going to say that character is a commoner who is a pig farmer doing pig farmer things, and you get to roll an adventurer. This is just the bare minimum of what the game considers someone qualified to be an adventurer. I'm not actually sure if that rule technically exists. We were playing Pathfinder, whereas most of us are more used to 3.5, so that might be an old 3.5 rule. In any event, though, that's the way that we played it. My friend had this character who had like a very, very poor stat array, and he decided to choose a character that could sort of make do without any good stats, which is a bad class because most good classes can take advantage of a high stat. But if you're sort of going through the books and looking through people's abilities, they kind of also have to have a high stat. Like, if you're a wizard, you can't play a wizard with a low intelligence. You can't play a cleric without a high wisdom. You can't play a bard with a low charisma. Your abilities don't function unless they're a certain threshold amount. So he was playing a character who literally could not use a lot of these abilities. If he was a fighter, he wouldn't be able to hit anything. If he was playing an archer, he wouldn't be able to hit anything. So he chose a sort of character that relied a little bit on their skills, which is a little bit more forgiving. Just because skills you get a certain guaranteed amount every time, and no matter what, the limit for the number of ranks you can have is the same no matter what your stats are. And the stats only apply to like a plus, like a range of plus, 4 at most at level 1. Well, plus 5, I guess, if you include racial bonus. So his character was this, I think it was a vigilante, it was the class in Pathfinder. And it's a really, really weak class, but it allowed him to sort of at least not it didn't give him any abilities he couldn't use outright. And this character was extremely, extremely weak in a mechanical sense there. Now, according to some people, this is a character that would be an amazing roleplay opportunity because it would let you sort of, defy the odds and play the person who's well out of their depth and all that other stuff. Now, the rest of us all had, like, really high stats, actually. Like, I rolled higher than I think I've rolled for any other character in my entire session of playing D&D. There's a guy who only rolled, like, 1 lower than me. There's another guy who rolled really high for him. He usually has really bad luck. So our entire group was these monstrous people with like 18s and stuff like that. And then there's this one little guy who's a little bit weaker than the town guard. And the reason that this character ended up not being interesting narratively is because he died like 3 sessions in, having, just died in a relatively mundane, normal encounter. And that can be a funny story in and of itself, but it's only really funny if they died in a way that's kind of interesting or impressive. He just got clubbed by an ogre and died instantly, which isn't really that fun of a story, because, like, anyone can get clubbed over the head by an ogre and die instantly. It didn't make for a character that we got to know very well. And it didn't make for a character that I think was super, super interesting in terms of like what their personal story was, what their personal goals were, because basically it was just like died on the starting line is how I would describe that, because it was 3 sessions in. This was a campaign that ran for like 100 sessions. Okay, this was a game that lasted for quite some time. So his next character that he rolls up is this very, very powerful support class build that's capable of giving us large bonuses. It makes it so that we can coast through combat really easily. He's a very effective fighter. He's very durable. That character was one that lasted from level or the 3rd campaign session onwards, because after he replaced it, that character didn't keep dying because his new character, which was much, much more powerful, was able to be in the game. You have to be in the game to contribute to the story, is basically what I'm saying here. And if you're playing a super, super weak character, you're not going to necessarily be in the game anymore, because your character is probably just going to die. Now, this can happen to any character. A fully optimized character that someone who's really good at the game makes can just get killed by a lucky critical from some guy with a great axe. There's that sort of saying, if you're low levels and you get hit by an orc with a great axe that rolled a natural 20, you could take like 30 points of damage at level 1, and that is an obscene amount of damage. Like, a character at level 1 probably has like 12 hit points if they're pretty tough. If they're like a barbarian that's really tough, they'll have like 16 hit points. That is an obscene amount of hit points for a level 1 character, and that will still instantly kill that character. It's one of those situations in this game where there is always that risk of death, but when you're an extremely weak character, that risk of death is extremely high. So I wouldn't recommend ever deliberately going out of your way to play a gimped character mechanically to say that your character is going to be more interesting in terms of the story. The next way that some people use the word weak is that they mean that the character has a weakness. And this is like Superman, in the sense that he's got his weakness to kryptonite. Now, no one would actually say that Superman is weak, but he has sort of ways that you could get under his defenses and beat him. There's actually a bunch technically. He's like weak to kryptonite, which he gets over. He's weak to the red sun, which he gets over, and he's weak to magic, which I don't think I've ever actually seen work against him. So he's air quotes weak to things. But in any event, it's that sort of one that I think can be interesting, but I don't think it actually often comes up in D&D in the same sort of way that it can potentially come up with other sorts of stories. So yeah, you can play with this one a little bit. I don't necessarily think that necessarily adds a ton to the story, because how often are you going to have a character that's only weak against one certain type of thing? Generally, even very optimized characters can be beaten by a very wide variety of different types of attacks. It's just that they're less statistically likely to fall prey to those, and they might have immunities to some very common sorts of things that they expect to be coming after them. A very common one, for example, for 3.5 players is like, you just have a ton of people running around with freedom of movement and mind blank, which made you like immune to grapples, crowd control effects, and it made you immune to like mind influencing effects. So if you're in a system where those sort of things are there, those are going to potentially be very, very standard. But yeah, being immune to things outright and then having a few weaknesses, not so common. Having a lot of things that could potentially kill you and a couple weaknesses, or a couple invulnerabilities, that's sort of more common. So, you know, this isn't really something that works in terms of the narrative of D&D. You're already weak to a lot of different things, even if you're not necessarily going to get killed in one shot from a lot of them. It's just too common to see characters that are vulnerable to huge numbers of different types of attacks there. The last way, I think, is the most interesting way, and if they're referring to it in this way, it's the one that I find is pretty much impossible to argue. They say that characters that have flaws are the most interesting ones. And those flaws can be like a mechanical weakness, in particular. It can be a roleplay weakness. It can be all sorts of different things. And these I do agree with in a very broad sense there. I don't think that having a flaw, though, makes a character weak, which is, I think, it comes down to a sort of semantics thing at that point in time. If that's all they mean, is that the character has a flaw. They've got a character flaw. They got a personality quirk or whatever. If that's all they're talking about, and yeah, that's absolutely true. I just don't agree that that's a weak character in that sort of way there. You can take it in another counterexample in the story there. In that same campaign, in that Reign of Winter one, I was playing a character that is, by most stretches of the imagination, considered a heavily overpowered character. My character actually was a nightmare, I think, for my DM to run against, because like, a lot of people will build a character that's really good at a thing, or they're going to be, you know, sort of more spread out, and they're kind of better at doing a whole bunch of little things. You're going to typically see the sort of toolbox of, like, you've got a paladin on a horse, in which case he's probably going to be very good at charging people with the lance, and he's probably not going to be all that great at doing very many other things. Like, there will be a few things that he can do besides that, like healing people with lay on hands or something like that. But for the most part, he's going to run up at you and just charge you with a lance, and you're probably going to explode. By contrast, someone like a rogue usually has a much broader toolkit. So there's a sort of dynamic in D&D where you're either going to be on one end of the spectrum or you're going to be on the other end of the spectrum. The problem was that my character was like a person who could so there's a way to build a character in Pathfinder, and I'll let you guys try and discover this on your own, where you're already by default capable of casting a huge number of different types of spells. And because you're able to choose from so many different types of spells, you can basically play as an arcane caster in terms of your party role, or you can play as a divine caster in terms of your party role, because like, whether you're a cleric or a wizard doesn't actually matter. It's the types of spells that you're using that matter. And if you're a wizard, it's very difficult to get the clerical spells like resurrection or heal or anything along those lines. Whereas if you're a cleric, it's really difficult to get the good battlefield control options that the wizard has. But there are ways to play the game so that you've got both all the healing as well as all of the good battlefield control options. And that makes it so that you're both good at doing what the wizard typically does, as well as what the cleric is really good at doing. It's easier to do this starting as a cleric and then going into doing what wizards can do, as opposed to the other way around, but it's not impossible to start as a wizard and then get all the stuff that clerics have that you would really want to fill the role. But anyway, my character was a near full caster that had that ability set. My character, as the type of character I was capable of doing really high damage with range attacks. I was allowed to switch out my feats at a moment's notice so that I had really good melee attacks instead of ranged attacks. I had the ability to use a whole bunch of just random nonsense abilities to be really good at skills. I was allowed to roll dice ahead of time and apply those to my rolls whenever the hell I wanted to. So my character was absolutely ridiculously versatile, but not only was my character versatile, my character was very good at each of the individual roles that I decided to take on, which meant that my character, like my DM, couldn't easily take a character or take a an encounter and throw it against my character in the hopes that that would somehow negate my strengths or advantages like you could in certain circumstances. Like, for example, if you're up against a paladin who's on a horse with a lance, there are ways to prevent him from charging you. In fact, there's a ton of different ways to stop him from charging you, meaning he's not capable of getting that really powerful damaging attack in against you. Similar, if you're up against a really, really focused archer, there are things that can shut down archery really, really hard in D&D and Pathfinder, despite the fact that both of those options can deal ridiculous amounts of damage. If you're up against a wizard who's heavily, heavily focused in mind-influencing effects, there's ways to fully negate that, and there's lots of ways to make that less dangerous to you. There's ways to negate people who really focus on pretty much any one subset, but if you're up against someone who can go from one style to another style really spontaneously and be really powerful at that second one, that's very, very difficult for a DM to actually sort of wrap their head around and challenge that character. And that's fine by me, because I don't actually go into D&D with the mindset of I want to be challenged. I want to be challenged on the theoretical side of things, of looking at my character sheet and figuring out what to build. That's where, to me, the fun challenge actually is. But in any event, this character was an absolute monster in terms of like their abilities, but despite that, I actually did most of what I was supposed to do through roleplay. I didn't actually use those mechanical abilities that I just said as often as I did talk to the NPCs. And in that realm, my character, while still very competent, I did get through a lot of those encounters, has some crippling flaws. And my character, because of this particular class that I had taken, again, brownie points if you know what class I took, was incapable of lying, or strictly speaking, the ability reads that I'm not allowed to break an oath. But I took that one step further because I found not breaking oaths to be really easy, just don't promise anything. But I took that one step further and said I can't tell any kinds of lies. That included breaking oaths and stuff like that. So this meant that I had to go through a lot of different conversations, walking on pins and needles, and that, for a character that is relying on that role play, or is relying on what I'm saying as a player, rather than my mechanical abilities to get through these encounters, because I had a lot of social skills, I had a lot of diplomacy, I had a lot of bluff, I had a lot of sense motive. I didn't have to roll those, because what I was saying to the DM was what was more important than the dice rolls, and he knew that I had high numbers for those, so he took that into account when he was considering what I was saying. But not being able to tell a lie when you're playing a character like my character was, is actually a very deep flaw for what they are, and being able to overcome that was something that created a lot of interesting and memorable experiences in that campaign. So I think that that is an example of that sort of flaw being existent in a very, very powerful character. It's definitely not what anyone would consider to be a weak character. And I think that flaws of this particular type can definitely be something that you want to strive for in a character, but at the same time, that powerful character that I was playing as there's an important thing to note here. My character and all those other characters that I said at the very start there had really high stats, were in powerful classes, were built relatively well. All of them survived to the end of the campaign. And that meant that we had the ability to tell our stories as the game was progressing. By contrast, that really weak character, designed poorly, didn't get a chance to tell their story. And to me, that seems like a much more important element to it than being able to say that, you had a more interesting story because that character was very, very weak there. So, it's the case of, would you rather have a story about someone who is a little bit powerful and got through things a little bit too easily, or do you want to have no story at all, is kind of the risk there. Now, there is a certain way of DMing a game such that weak characters can get from one end of the campaign to the other, and it seems really exciting, and it seems really intense. And if you think what that probably is, that's the DM cheating a lot in favor of the players. And I don't necessarily disagree with this playstyle on its own merits. It's not something I personally run. From my part, I will, if I see that all of my player characters in my campaign when I'm running as a DM are super weak, I will nerf the ever-loving hell out of all of my encounters without it ever being apparent that they're in as much danger as they were. Like, the way I DM, I usually have to have these characters running against, like, my players are level 5 or like level 6 or whatever, and I have to run them against like level 3 enemies or something like that. It's kind of that bad, if I'm totally honest with you. They're not necessarily the best optimizers. Yeah, that's the sort of way that you run this. If you look at a story like Lord of the Rings or whatever, or The Hobbit, where it's an everyman kind of character that's clearly out of their depths, like if we look at Frodo or Sam Gamgee or Merry or Pippin, they're clearly outclassed by the things that they're up against, and in spite of that, they manage to get from one end of the story to the other. Look at Bilbo Baggins, who's clearly outclassed by all the things that he's encountering. These are stories that cannot really exist for the majority of tables. If we took 1,000,000 games of D&D and had someone play one of those characters, there might be one person who has that experience of going from one end to the other and having the same sort of story as was in Lord of the Rings. The other 999,999 people are at some point in that story probably going to fail at something that those characters didn't and die as a result of it. So it really comes as a sort of moment where you want to sort of at least be strong enough to get from one end of the adventure to the other without having it be, too perilous. Or if you want your character to die magnificently at some point in your story, that could be the thing that you're angling for, in which case I kind of, as a DM, don't really want you to do that, because what I'm trying to also do is craft a story which is going to involve the players going from one end to the other. So if you want your character to die dramatically, talk to the DM and maybe arrange something that's dramatic and appropriate at the very, very end of the campaign. I actually had one character that I was considering doing that with, but I just figured, and you know what, screw it, I'll just roll with it and see what happens. And that character ended up getting killed off in the epilogue rather than during the actual campaign game. So you can still arrange for those stories to be in the game, even if it's a lot less interesting than if it actually happened organically. I'll grant that, but you can never guarantee that's going to be at an interesting moment. And more often than not, it's just doing something stupid that your character gets killed in. So anyway, that is my little talk about D&D. Or technically speaking, Pathfinder, but I view it as pretty much the same sort of thing there. So anyway, I'll be doing some more talks about this one. This one was more about something like a theory or whatever, but I'll be doing the next one that's going to be just more dedicated to storytelling about campaigns that I played in and stuff like that. The Reign of Winter campaign was actually pretty interesting for a pre-made campaign. We don't usually play those. Usually all of us as DM, our group has like a lot of DMs, and I'm one of them at this point in time. All of us usually create our own campaign settings from scratch. I think that's just sort of the environment that I got introduced to. I know there was one of them that used to run a lot of pre-mades, doesn't DM so much anymore. So I just got introduced to the game as being something where you're expected to have a pre-made campaign as a DM, but I don't think that's true whatsoever. So yeah, in any event though, I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.